So Joe, just casting your mind back to mid-60s,
Mm.
what was your initial contact with Pink Floyd? How did you get involved with them initially?
I met Peter Jenner and Andrew King through Hoppy. I think I met them the night there was a meeting at Hoppy's flat to create the infrastructure for the London Free School, which was a rather eccentric, idealistic venture to bring our accumulated privileged knowledge to the people of the neighborhood. I think Peter and Andrew were teaching at the LSE or something at the time. And so we became friends, and I was working for Elektra Records. I was opening the London office of Elektra. And at some point, I think it was around the summer of '66, Peter and Andrew said, there's this group that we want you to hear, and here's a tape. And then they played at the church in Powis Square at a benefit to raise funds for the London Free School. And I heard them there, and I thought they were great. No, I remember thinking that they were terrific. I mean, it was a very original, unusual, and very musical, adventurous thing. And the mood at those events at Powis Square were great. And then they did their sort of big coming out at the International Times launch at the Roundhouse in October of '66, I think it was. And that was a fantastic party. I mean, it was they and the Soft Machine played, and that was really the defining, it sort of defined who are the bands of the London underground scene. And it was clearly the Floyd and the Soft Machine. And I preferred the Floyd's music to the Soft Machine's music. I think the only recording that really reflects what the Floyd sounded like in that autumn of '66 period, and possibly even into the spring of '67, is the recording of Interstellar Overdrive that is on the soundtrack of Let's All Make Love Tonight in London. That's the only time they really stretched a track to the length that they tended to play when they played live. I mean, when they played live, it was, the structure was very like a jazz band. They would state the theme. Syd would sing the verse and the chorus. And then they would go into an extended instrumental improvisation. That was the dominant sound that you had, was instrumental. Was the vocals were just the punctuation, the beginning and the end, in a way. And the only time you really have that extended improvisation with Syd as the only guitarist is, to my knowledge, on Interstellar Overdrive. And I played the tape to Jack Holtzman, who was the head of Elektra. And he didn't get it. And that was part of a whole series of events which led to a kind of "you can't fire me, I quit" kind of conversation between me and Holtzman. It was one of a number of issues. It wasn't the issue which triggered my leaving Elektra, but it was just part of a pattern in which he wanted me to focus on promoting Judy Collins and Phil Oakes, and I wanted to be scouting out English bands and artists and signing them to Elektra. And that was just one of a half dozen incidents. No, when I left Elektra, and I had, I produced a few significant things for Elektra. I produced the first Incredible String Band record.
Was Floyd really your first major? I mean, it wasn't a signing.
Well, it was, yeah. Floyd was not, unfortunately, a signing. My deal was just to produce the single.
Arnold Layne.
Arnold Layne. And we went into the studio. And I believe we recorded it in a day, both tracks, and then we mixed it the following day. Well, first of all, you have the oddness of the lyrics. That the lyric is definitely not like any other pop tune. I mean, the character and the situation is. I mean, the BBC refused to play it because it was, odd and kind of saucy in a way.
Well, it's about this English pervert.
Yeah, about an English pervert. But that's the curious thing about Syd, is that he was in the middle of this psychedelic band that played these long jams and was known for the light shows and the effects and all of this stuff. He was a pop songwriter, and a very good one. But it was clear that he was a songwriter in a group that wasn't really playing that sort of music in a way. And there wasn't that clear a connection between his songwriting and what was going on in the group that he was the leader of. It was two different things, really.
And there seems to be that split in him in a way as well, in that he was also a very inventive guitarist. So he was pushing that.
Oh yeah, no, he wasn't reluctant about the direction the group was going. Quite the contrary. I think he was leading them in that direction. He looked upon these songs, this demo of, well, this is just something I threw on to a tape once just for fun. I don't really take it that seriously. If you want to use them, go ahead. I mean, his songs were very almost childish in a way, but wonderful. And if you think about, Candy in the Currant Bun, I'm High, Don't Try to Spoil My Fun. I mean, they're kind of, and even the kind of finger wagging at Arnold Layne it's like a little kid, and that da 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 da. It's very simple. It's the kind of thing you'd kind of poke out on a kid's toy piano or something, but wonderfully sophisticated at the same time.
Listening to Arnold Layne now, it's still pretty fresh, and it's got a lot of inventiveness in there. I mean, there's just these little touches, strange little sounds popped in.
Well, John Wood is a fantastic engineer, and he was, I think that was the first rock record that he ever engineered. I mean, he was basically a classical engineer, and he loved them. I mean, he was intrigued, and I think they really liked him. And I know that when they recorded See Emily Play, they came back to Sound Techniques, to his studio, and used him as the engineer to get the sound they wanted, because they weren't getting exactly the sound they wanted for the next single at EMI.
What does it bring back to you, that recording?
I hadn't remembered that we double-tracked all the vocals. It does sound clean and sharp and crisp, and all those little funny touches that I think they asked John, what can we do? Can we put a little echo here? And there were these little echo effects on the drums and things like that. And in those days you didn't have computerized boards, so it was like a take, to get a mix right. You had to kind of get all the moves just right. And I remember, even though there were only 4 faders, because you only had 4 tracks, the final mix, having John on one fader, me on another, and Roger coming in to help out at a certain point at the beginning of the solo, because I think we switched. I think Rick overdubbed the organ solo, so it was on the vocal track. So we had to move it or change the level or change something, and we needed an extra pair of hands. And Roger was the practical leader in a way. He was the one who you dealt with. I remember dealing with Roger as the guy that would make a decision on behalf of the band. But everybody deferred to Syd creatively. I mean, it was Syd's song. Syd wasn't as clear and authoritative as Roger, and he wouldn't necessarily say, do this or do that, or I like this, I don't like that. But Roger would take it upon himself to say, Syd, is that okay? I think that in a way the Floyd had two things going for them which set them apart. I mean, I think their adventurousness instrumentally and the eccentricity of their sound set them apart. But I don't think that would have worked to make them as successful if it hadn't been for those great songs that anchored everything. And certainly the first record, the first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, is a record of Syd's songs. That's what it is. I mean, it doesn't have extended instrumental jams. It's a very different sort of record than the later records.
It's really the foundation of his reputation, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think Bike, for example, is a great, great track. You know, that's my favorite, I think, of all the things. The combination of the lyric with the sound, you know, the kind of, again, childlike. I've got a bike. You know, it's like, whoa, I'm 8 years old and I've got a bike, you know. And the sound, it's very well produced. I mean, it's a very well put together track. And in a way manages to combine some of the psychedelic elements of their live show into a very compact 3-minute track. Nice little pop song. But again, very eccentric, very subject matter, not anything you'd find, you know, coming from Denmark Street, you know. It was definitely Syd's own vision of the world. EMI in those days was a label like most British labels. They were used to artists using their studios, using their producers. Polydor was a very unusual new breed of company which liked working with independents. But EMI said, no. You use our studios, use our producers. They gave them a lot more money than Polydor was going to. And so I was out of a job as the producer. And I think the group felt a bit bad about that.
EMI coming in, the effect of that on the recordings was to mute Syd's creativity.
It's very hard for me to say what the effect was because I wasn't privy to what went on in the sessions at Abbey Road. I don't know what Norman Smith told them to do or didn't tell them to do. I know that when we went in the studio, there was no discussion. I mean, it wasn't that Syd said, oh, I want this to be a 10-minute long jam. We were there to make a single. And that's what a single was a 3-minute song. And when we were doing the track for the Peter Whitehead film, everybody felt, oh, this is fun, this is great, because we can stretch out and do a 10-minute track and do it more like we do live. But no, there was no thought in those days that you could do that kind of recording and put it on a record. So I don't think that there was a feeling that, oh, big bad EMI is going to come along and tell us we can't do this. I think everybody agreed. It was just a kind of general view that that's what you did when you made a record, was you put together songs and you made them 3 minutes long so they could be singles, they could be played on the radio. There wasn't a tension between, you know, Syd wanting to do something different or Roger wanting to do something different and being told by the record company you can't do that, as far as I know. I like to think, obviously, that if I produced Piper at the Gates of Dawn, it might have been different. Whether it would have been better, I think it's a great record, so I can't say, oh, it would have been better. It might have been different, but whether it might have been better or worse, I don't know. I mean, they felt a loyalty to UFO, and they liked UFO, and UFO had been the real launching pad for them. So they agreed that they would come back regardless of what happened, regardless of how big they were, they would come back in June and do one night. And I didn't really see them very much after March, between March and June. And I ran into Syd in Cambridge Circus once, I think around May, with his girlfriend, with Lindsay, who I always liked. I always thought Lindsay was great. And he seemed very stoned, very out of it. And someone, I can't remember if it was Lindsay or someone who was around, said Syd's been taking acid every day for a week or something like that. And then the next time I saw him was the middle of June when they came to play the gig. And there was no artist entrance at UFO. Everybody came through the front and it was completely packed. There were people queuing, trying to, waiting to get in. And I was standing by the door, overseeing everything at the door, and the group came down the stairs, and I had to kind of, push the crowd aside to let the group come through. And one by one, and because of the crush, they passed, very close in front of me. And one by one, they came through. Hi, Joe, how you doing? Good to see you, etc., etc. And the thing I remembered about Syd, it was one of his most distinctive features, and I think you can see it in some of the photographs there, is this incredible, you can certainly hear it in the songs, this twinkle, this kind of child, boyish, impish energy and mischievous look. And that was always one of the most attractive things about Syd. And I remember when he passed right in front of my face like this, and it was as if somebody had just turned the switch off. The eyes were very vacant. And he just sort of nodded, went through. And that night, he would spend long periods of time just standing on stage, not playing. And I'm not sure if that night specifically, but I think that was one of the nights when the group got sufficiently worried about what was going on with Syd that that's how they came to recruit Dave to sort of play behind him and fill in, hoping that he would come around. And but eventually he didn't.
Must have been a shock, though, to see him like that.
Yeah, it was a shock. And yeah, to see him coming in and then to see him on stage, it was very, it was sad. It was very sad.
Did you have was it clear that this was a drug-connected thing?
That was the assumption. I mean, I think people were talking, that year, 67, was the first year that you ever heard the phrase, acid casualty. And there were people around who you could see, people were taking a lot of LSD in those days. And for most people, that meant taking it on the weekends. And there were some people who seemed to take it a lot more often. And you could kind of begin to tell, there was an obvious damage that would happen with too much.
There's such a controversy around this. For instance, Dougie Fields, who shared a flat with him in Earls Court Square after this period, was saying that Syd didn't actually take much acid at that time, at least, and related it much more to his inability to deal with
the success,
and a decision to withdraw out of London and into painting and out of music.
Listen, I was not close to Syd in those days. I can't say. I know that people that spring said that he took a lot of acid. Now, that may have been triggered by a desire to withdraw from the pressures of the success of the group. I mean, Roger and Nick, to me, always seemed very level-headed, very clear. They wanted the group to be a success. and they handled it with tremendous aplomb. Rick kind of the same, although he was more of a kind of along for the ride guy in a way, less assertive, I suppose. But Syd, you know, it's like, you know, the mystery of where creativity comes from, you know, how sensitive and how unusual and how distinctive a personality can write those songs and can create that sound, and what other complications does that type of personality include? Who knows? I never saw Syd take acid. I mean, I never saw him put something in his mouth, so I'm not somebody to say, well, this is what happened and this is what didn't happen. I do know that the word around the group that spring was that Syd was taking a very great deal of acid.
And you witnessed yourself this kind of shutting off.
Yeah, and I saw a huge change take place in him, and which seemed to me to be more than just psychological. I mean, it wasn't just a mood that he was in or a feeling that he had. It was something serious had gone wrong inside there. You know, the innocence, I suppose. That's the thing that it's very difficult to find in music today. That was one of the things about the 60s, was that people didn't have such a incredible, they weren't surrounded by so much information. So they created worlds by themselves, or with little bits, little shards of influences. That was the great thing about England, was that it got these little tiny shards of American culture, and little shards of French culture, and little shards of this or that or the other thing, and people would create these amazing structures out of these little slivers of something. And there was an innocence about it. And you have these people emerge with these incredible visions that were, I think, much stronger and much more unique and individual, for the fact that they were so, in a way, not isolated, but they were created in their own little world in their own little way. And Syd was a great example of that. Syd is extremely English, and in a way, as I said, he's very much in the tradition of those records. Arnold Layne is very much in the tradition of mid-60s English pop. And it also has that whimsical tradition, that childishness is part of an English tradition of Alice in Wonderland and Wind in the Willows and all that kind of thing, that sort of nostalgia which much of British literature has for childhood, for the idyllic Victorian childhood, and the pre-World War I. I mean, I think in a way a lot of English culture got locked in the nostalgia for the innocence of that era before the trenches and before the, there is that echoing down the decades of the 20th century of that turn of the century, whimsical, privileged, I don't know, free spirits, untainted by the knowledge of what was to come. And there's a decadence about England that in a way was more decadent. I mean, no American would think of writing about a guy sniffing girls' panties, in backyards. That was an English kind of decadence. But it was mixed with this particularly English kind of innocence. Very different than the hard-edged knowingness, urbanness of, a Dylan or one of the leading American figures of that era.
Just to ask about the UFO Club.
The first UFO, which Hoppy and I started because we needed to make some money. We saw that this was something that was happening, that would draw people, and we saw it as a means to keep the wolf from the door. I'd met Hoppy when I was over here as the tour manager of a blues tour with Muddy Waters and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and people like that. And Hoppy'd been a freelance photographer hired by the Melody Maker to come and take our picture. And I'd met him just that way by accident, and then we became friends. And so we went into it as a partnership, rented the place. It was an Irish dance hall. They used to have Cayleys. And we rented it, put up some posters, and that first night, the place was packed with freaks. And they were all astounded that there were so many of them, because I think everyone there thought, well, me and my friends, the only ones who were really into this kind of thing. And then suddenly there was a room in the West End of London listening to Pink Floyd, dancing in the light shows, all dressed like freaks, and thinking, wow, there's a lot of us. So it was a great moment, you know, and it sort of spread from there. So it was a pretty unique place, and it lasted from December of '66 at the Blarney Club until July, when the News of the World attacked us in print. They had a picture of a topless girl on the front and said that teenage girls were dancing naked in the lights of this club right next to a police station in the West End. And, you know, being the only newspaper the policemen, according to legend, read, the Irish landlord's gifts of a case of whiskey at Christmas to the local police station had sufficed to keep them out of our hair to a certain degree until then. But I think after the News of the World, they rang up Mr. Gannon and said, sorry, mate, we're going to raid the place if you keep it open.
So that was the end of
that was the end of an era, yeah. And in a way, the period of Floyd between the first UFO gig and the Games for May, that period is the period. After that, it became, as most things in England, it got, or in the West, in the capitalist world, it became a commodity, and it became something that everybody wanted to be in on, and you had weekend people who'd never taken a drug in their life putting on bells and caftans and coming down to see the Pink Floyd. And so the atmosphere changed, and it never was the same. That period from December '66 to May '67, that was it. That was the golden period of this scene, and then it was over.
In a way, that mirrors Syd's golden period.
Exactly. And Syd was the dominant personality from a artistic point of view. I mean, Hoppy was certainly the dominant personality in the scene overall, but Syd was the minstrel.